The airport buzzed with an overwhelming intensity, a chaotic labyrinth of humanity. Long security lines snaked endlessly. Impatient travelers shuffled forward while announcements echoed, their words blending into an unintelligible blur. Rolling luggage wheels clicked rhythmically against the polished floors, adding a relentless cadence to the scene. Laura Mitchell, a 52-year-old marketing executive from Boston, stood amidst this storm of activity, her nerves frayed. The announcement of a 3-hour delay had already derailed her carefully planned schedule, leaving her grappling with frustration. Laura had spent the better part of her morning on edge, her patience eroded by a series of tense exchanges with customer service representatives. Each conversation, fraught with complaints about rescheduled flights and missed connections, only fueled her irritation. She felt entirely justified in her annoyance, her mind replaying the disruptions she would now have to navigate. By the time she reached gate C-17, the boarding process was already underway. Her pulse quickened as she hurriedly approached, her muttered apologies brushing past in different ears. With a hasty step, Laura entered the narrow jet bridge, the metallic echo of her footsteps punctuating her unease. She carried her travel bag awkwardly, weaving through the tightly packed line of passengers. As she reached her assigned seat, 17B, a groan escaped her lips. It was a middle seat, a placement she despised, particularly on fully booked flights like this one. Laura squeezed into the row and glanced at her seatmates. To her left sat a young man in military uniform, his posture impeccably straight. His expression was calm, his focus directed out the window. There was a quiet dignity about him, as though he carried a sense of purpose invisible to others. To her right was a college-aged woman, her oversized headphones signaling her intent to avoid interaction. A paperback novel rested in the woman's lap, her eyes scanning the pages in apparent disinterest. As Laura shoved her bag under the seat in front of her, she noticed the soldier's gaze flicker in her direction. It wasn't a look of annoyance or warmth, just a neutral acknowledgement of her presence. But to Laura, frazzled and worn thin by the events of the day, it felt dismissive. A pang of irritation flared within her. "Well, I guess we're all crammed in like sardines, huh?" she muttered, her voice carrying a mix of self-pity and sarcasm. She wasn't sure whether she was speaking to herself or inviting a response from the soldier. He remained silent, his gaze returning to the window as if her comment had not been made. Laura's annoyance deepened. The silence felt pointed, almost as though he was intentionally ignoring her. Her eyes darted to his uniform, the crispness of the fabric and the neatly placed insignias catching her attention. "Flying on taxpayers' money, I see," she added, her voice tinged with biting sarcasm. This time, the soldier turned to her. His face was calm, his voice measured. "Yes, ma'am," he replied simply, his tone respectful yet unyielding. The interaction drew the attention of nearby passengers. The woman to Laura's right shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes now fixed firmly on her book. A man several rows back frowned slightly but refrained from saying anything. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, the tension almost palpable. Laura, however, remained undeterred. Her frustration sought an outlet, and the soldier's silence only added fuel to the fire. "What? No comeback?" she pressed, her tone louder now. "Guess discipline means keeping your mouth shut, huh?" The soldier did not react. His expression remained steady, his eyes fixed back on the view outside the plane. His lack of response, far from diffusing the situation, only served to aggravate Laura further. The unease created by the exchange lingered long after the interaction had ended. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, Laura leaned back in her seat, her irritation refusing to subside. She couldn't understand why the soldier's silence irked her so much. Was it his refusal to engage, or was it the composed demeanor that seemed to highlight her own lack of restraint? She stole glances at him throughout the flight, half expecting him to speak up or show some visible sign of annoyance. But he didn't. His calm remained unbroken, his focus unwavering. He sat with his hands lightly clasped on his lap, his posture seemingly unaffected even as the plane jolted slightly during turbulence. When the flight attendant rolled the drink cart down the aisle, Laura seized the opportunity to break the silence. She ordered a black coffee, her tone sharp. The soldier, on the other hand, quietly requested water, his voice calm and courteous. As the attendant handed him the bottle, Laura couldn't resist another jab. "Guess even soldiers stick to the basics," she remarked under her breath. This time, the soldier turned fully toward her. His expression remained composed, but his voice carried a subtle firmness that demanded attention. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to get home." His words, so calm and unprovocative, momentarily disarmed Laura. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of self-awareness, a recognition of her own unnecessary hostility. But her pride would not allow her to concede. She crossed her arms and turned away, muttering a dismissive, "whatever," under her breath. Around them, passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The woman to Laura's right edged closer to the window, as if physically distancing herself from the tension. A man a few rows ahead craned his neck, as though prepared to intervene if the situation escalated. Yet, the soldier's restraint prevented any further conflict, leaving Laura alone with her simmering frustration. As the plane cruised at altitude, the minutes stretched endlessly. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. She couldn't shake the feeling that the soldier's calmness was a silent judgment of her behavior. His refusal to engage felt more damning than any retort could have been. Each glance at him unearthed an uncomfortable mix of emotions. Guilt, irritation, and a growing sense of unease churned within her. She told herself it was fatigue, the culmination of a stressful day and an inconvenient flight. Yet, deep down, she knew there was something more. Something about this young soldier's quiet dignity that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite define. The flight dragged on, and the weight of silence between Laura and the soldier became almost unbearable for her. Each passing minute stretched longer than the last, the tension gnawing at her as if it were alive. Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her annoyance refusing to dissipate. She kept glancing at the soldier, almost willing him to react, to give her some sign that her earlier comments had bothered him. But no matter how hard she searched, his demeanor remained unchanged, calm, composed, and resolutely focused on the small oval window beside him. It was this unwavering composure that frustrated her the most. How could he remain so unbothered, so completely unaffected by her jabs? For Laura, it was almost as if her words had never landed. She replayed the brief exchange in her mind, each time hoping to find a crack in his armor, a trace of annoyance or discomfort. But there was nothing. His calmness was impenetrable, and that only made her feel smaller in contrast. The turbulence rocking the plane periodically drew murmurs from other passengers, but the soldier barely moved. His hands rested lightly on his lap, and only a slight twitch of his fingers betrayed any awareness of the bumps. Laura, meanwhile, couldn't help but notice how natural his posture seemed, as though he belonged to a different world entirely, a world where chaos and discomfort were met with steady resilience. When the flight attendant came by to check on the passengers, Laura welcomed the distraction. She ordered another coffee, this time sipping it slowly as though to steady her nerves. The soldier requested nothing, his polite refusal barely audible over the hum of the engines. Laura watched him out of the corner of her eye, a part of her still waiting for him to offer some explanation, some insight into his thoughts. But none came. He remained the same, silent and unmoved, a stark contrast to her own growing unease. Finally, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. Her voice cut through the quiet. "So, where are you headed?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to draw the attention of a few nearby passengers. The soldier turned to her, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Home," he replied simply, his voice devoid of any malice or irritation. The single word hung in the air, and for a moment, Laura felt foolish for asking. Of course, he was going home. What else would he be doing? But her stubbornness refused to let her stop there. "Must be nice," she added, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Bet you're looking forward to some peace and quiet after flying on someone else's dime." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, but the soldier didn't rise to meet it. Instead, he nodded once, his expression unchanged. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "It is nice." The simplicity of his response caught her off guard. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify himself, just a quiet acknowledgement of her words, stripped of all emotion. Laura felt her irritation spike again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else. Guilt. She didn't know why she felt it, but it was there, lingering in the back of her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Maybe it was the way he spoke, calm and measured, refusing to stoop to her level. Or maybe it was the faint hint of exhaustion she thought she saw in his eyes, the kind that went beyond physical fatigue. Whatever it was, it made her feel small. As the flight wore on, Laura found herself retreating into her own thoughts. The soldier's silence had disarmed her in a way she hadn't expected, leaving her with nothing to hold on to but her own frustration. She thought about her morning, about the chaos at the airport, the delays, the arguments with customer service, and realized how much of her anger she had been carrying with her. She glanced at the soldier again, this time with a different perspective. His uniform caught her eye, the insignias and patches a silent testament to a life she knew nothing about. For the first time, she wondered who he was. What was his story? Why was he wearing that uniform today? But the questions remained unasked, and the silence stretched on. When the plane finally began its descent, Laura felt a strange mix of relief and regret. Relief that the flight was almost over, and she could finally escape the tension she had created. Regret that she hadn't handled things differently. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Laura grabbed her bag and stood in the aisle as soon as she could. She avoided looking at the soldier, her cheeks flushing slightly as she felt his gaze on her for the briefest of moments. She told herself it didn't matter, that this was just another forgettable interaction in the long list of daily frustrations she faced. But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. Outside the gate, Laura rushed to the baggage claim, eager to put the whole experience behind her. The soldier's calm, unwavering demeanor lingered in her mind, gnawing at her in a way she couldn't quite understand. She told herself she would forget him, that by the time she left the airport, he would be nothing more than a passing memory. But she wouldn't. Not even close. The following morning, Laura sat at her kitchen table, the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. It was her usual routine, a moment of calm before diving into the chaos of her day. She scrolled through the news on her tablet, skimming headlines and mentally planning her schedule. But one headline stopped her cold. Local soldier killed during humanitarian mission overseas. Her heart skipped a beat. Something about the image accompanying the article felt familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. With trembling hands, she tapped the screen to open the full story. The page loaded slowly, her breath catching as the photo came into focus. It was him, the same soldier who had sat beside her on the plane, calm and composed despite her relentless jabs. The name beneath the photo read, Private First Class Ethan Carter. Laura's chest tightened as she read the details. Ethan had been deployed to a war-torn region just weeks earlier, part of a team assisting with the evacuation of families from a conflict zone. His team had been ambushed during a rescue mission, and despite the chaos, Ethan had shielded 2 young children with his body, sacrificing himself to save their lives. The children survived. Ethan didn't. Laura felt the air leave her lungs as the weight of the story settled on her. Her hands trembled, her eyes scanning the article over and over, desperate to convince herself she was mistaken. But she wasn't. It was him, the same soldier who had endured her insults with quiet dignity, who had shown restraint and grace in the face of her hostility, was now being hailed as a hero for his selfless sacrifice. And Laura, lost in her own frustration and pettiness, had failed to see the man behind the uniform. The words on the screen blurred as Laura stared at her tablet, her mind reeling from the realization. The soldier, Private First Class Ethan Carter, was gone. The quiet young man who had sat beside her, enduring her jabs with grace, had given his life in service to others, and Laura had treated him with nothing but contempt. She set the tablet down on the kitchen table, her hands trembling. The article had gone into detail about Ethan's heroism, recounting how he had shielded 2 young children during an ambush in a war-torn country. His team had been helping evacuate families from a dangerous conflict zone when their convoy was attacked. Despite the chaos, Ethan had thrown himself into harm's way, saving the lives of those children at the cost of his own. The more Laura read, the heavier her guilt became. She couldn't stop picturing his calm, composed face as he sat beside her on the flight. She remembered his soft yet firm voice when he had finally responded to her barbs. "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to get home." She had dismissed him then, chalking his restraint up to discipline or indifference. But now, with the knowledge of his sacrifice, his silence felt profound. It wasn't indifference, it was strength. It was the quiet dignity of a man who had no time for petty squabbles because his focus was on something far greater than himself. Laura buried her face in her hands as tears streamed down her cheeks. She couldn't shake the memory of how she had treated him, the biting remarks she had thrown his way without a second thought. Her words replayed in her mind like a relentless echo. "Flying on taxpayers' money, I see. Guess even soldiers stick to the basics." How had she allowed herself to be so cruel, so thoughtless? She had been frustrated, yes. The delays, the chaos at the airport, the discomfort of the middle seat. All of it had pushed her to the edge. But none of that justified the way she had acted. None of it excused the way she had reduced Ethan to nothing more than a convenient outlet for her anger. And now, she would never have the chance to apologize. Laura sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She thought about Ethan's family, his mother, his younger sister, who would now be grieving the loss of a son and brother. She thought about the children he had saved, who would grow up with their lives intact because of his selflessness. She thought about her own actions, and for the first time in years, Laura found herself confronting a part of herself she had always ignored. For so long, she had prided herself on being honest and direct, often using her bluntness as an excuse for behavior that was, at best, inconsiderate and, at worst, downright cruel. She had always believed she was justified in speaking her mind, no matter how it affected others. But Ethan's death had forced her to look in the mirror, and what she saw was a woman who had let her own frustrations and prejudices dictate her actions. It was an ugly truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. Over the next few days, Laura couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. She read every article she could find about him, piecing together fragments of his life. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio, raised by a single mother who had worked tirelessly to support him and his younger sister. He had joined the military straight out of high school, driven by a desire to make a difference in the world. Ethan's record was full of commendations for his service. He had been part of disaster relief efforts, helped rebuild communities after natural disasters, and had even volunteered for humanitarian missions in some of the world's most dangerous regions. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a hero, and Laura had treated him like he was nothing. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her guilt any longer, Laura decided to take action. She didn't know what she hoped to achieve, but she knew she couldn't just sit idly by. She began by reaching out to a charity mentioned in one of the articles about Ethan, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting the families of fallen soldiers. Laura made a donation in Ethan's name, though it felt like a small gesture compared to the magnitude of his sacrifice. She wrote a heartfelt note to accompany her contribution, apologizing for the way she had treated him and expressing her admiration for his bravery and selflessness. But even that didn't feel like enough. Laura also decided to attend a local memorial service being held in Ethan's honor. She wasn't sure if she would have the courage to speak to his family, but she felt compelled to be there, to pay her respects and acknowledge the impact he had made, not just on the world, but on her own life. The service was held at a small church in Ethan's hometown. As Laura walked in, she was struck by the number of people who had gathered to honor him. The pews were filled with friends, family, and strangers alike, all united by their admiration for a man who had given so much. Laura sat near the back, listening as people shared stories about Ethan, his kindness, his dedication, his unwavering commitment to helping others. She learned about the time he had spent mentoring at-risk youth in his community, about the letters he had written to his sister while deployed, encouraging her to follow her dreams. Each story painted a picture of a man who was not only courageous but deeply compassionate. When the service ended, Laura hesitated before approaching Ethan's family. His mother, a petite woman with a kind face, stood near the front of the church, surrounded by well-wishers. Laura's heart raced as she stepped forward, unsure of what to say. "Mrs. Carter?" she began, her voice trembling. The woman turned to her, her eyes red from tears but filled with warmth. "Yes? My name is Laura Mitchell," she said. I was on a flight with your son recently. I didn't know him well, but I just wanted to say how sorry I am for your loss. He was an incredible man." Mrs. Carter smiled softly, her expression tinged with sadness. "Thank you," she said. He was one of a kind." Laura hesitated, her guilt bubbling to the surface. "I also wanted to apologize," she added, her voice breaking. "I wasn't kind to him on that flight. I said things I regret, and I wish I could take them back. He deserved so much better." Mrs. Carter reached out and took Laura's hand. "Ethan didn't hold grudges," she said gently. "If he was anything, he was forgiving. And I'm sure he'd appreciate you being here today." Tears filled Laura's eyes as she squeezed the woman's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. As Laura left the church, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in days. She couldn't undo her actions, but she could honor Ethan's memory by striving to be better, by letting go of her own prejudices, by treating others with kindness and respect, and by remembering the quiet strength of a young soldier who had shown her the true meaning of grace. Ethan Carter had changed her life, and she would carry his lesson with her forever.